Chosen one. Have you ever had a moment where nothing in your life felt wrong, but nothing felt right either? Not a breakdown, not a crisis. Just this quiet, confusing space where the things that used to excite you don't hit the same anymore, and the version of you that once felt certain now feels unfamiliar. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, it's subtle, almost easy to ignore. But it stays with you. You start questioning small things, the way you spend your time, the conversations you tolerate, the habits you once defended. Even the goals you were chasing begin to feel slightly off. And the strangest part is, you can't fully explain why. That's where most people panic. They think something is wrong. They assume they're losing direction. But what if this isn't confusion? What if this is transition? The quiet discomfort of OUTGROWNG, your old self. There's a specific kind of discomfort that doesn't come from pain, it comes from growth. It shows up when your environment still reflects who you used to be, but internally, you've already started changing. You might still be around the same people, doing the same routines, following the same patterns, but something inside you isn't fully present anymore. You laugh, but it feels slightly forced. You participate, but part of you is observing from a distance. This isn't disconnection in a negative sense. It's awareness expanding faster than your external life can catch up. Most people don't talk about this stage because it's not easy to explain. It doesn't come with a clear label. There's no obvious milestone. It's just a slow realization that you don't fully belong in the version of life you once built for yourself. And that realization can feel lonely. Not because you're alone, but because the old version of you fit perfectly into spaces that the new version of you is starting to question. When clarity, Kamal A.T. once. One of the biggest misconceptions about personal growth is that clarity arrives like a light switch. That one day you'll just know exactly who you are, what you want, and where you're going. But real transformation rarely works like that. Instead, it shows up in fragments. A thought here, a feeling there, a moment where something clicks, but only partially. You begin to notice patterns you ignored before. You become more aware of what drains you. You start recognizing what feels aligned and what doesn't. But you still don't have the full picture. And that in-between space can feel frustrating. Because you're no longer who you used to be, but you're not fully who you're becoming yet either. This is the stage where people often try to rush decisions, just to escape the uncertainty. They jump into new paths too quickly. They force clarity instead of allowing it to develop naturally. But growth doesn't respond well to pressure. It responds to awareness. Why your interests are changing without warning. You may have noticed that things you once cared deeply about don't hold the same weight anymore. It could be the type of content you consume, the conversations you engage in, even the goals you once worked toward. At first, it feels confusing. You might even question your consistency or discipline. But this shift isn't random. It's a sign that your internal priorities are evolving. As you grow, your mind naturally starts filtering things differently. What once felt meaningful may now feel surface level. What once excited you may now feel repetitive. This doesn't mean those things were wrong. They were just aligned with a previous version of you. And now you're moving beyond that version. The challenge is that your external life doesn't update as quickly as your internal world. So for a while, you exist in both spaces at once. Part of you still connected to who you were, and another part quietly stepping into something new. The loneliness that comes from seeing differently. There's a certain kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from seeing things differently than you used to. You start noticing dynamics in relationships that you didn't notice before. You become more aware of how certain conversations revolve around the same patterns. You might find yourself less interested in gossip, less engaged in surface-level interactions, less willing to pretend. And while nothing dramatic has happened externally, internally, everything feels different. This can create distance, not always physically, but emotionally. You may still be present, but not fully invested in the same way. And that shift can feel isolating. Because it's not about rejecting people. It's about no longer resonating with certain frequencies of interaction. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of growth. People often think something is wrong with them during this phase. But in reality, they're just becoming more aware of what aligns with who they're becoming. Why you feel like you're strting over, even when you're not. There's a moment in personal growth where it feels like everything you've built is being questioned. Not destroyed, not lost. Just reevaluated. You start looking at your habits, your routines, your direction, and instead of feeling confident, you feel uncertain. It can feel like you're going backwards, like you're starting over. But that's not what's happening. You're refining. You're becoming more intentional. The version of you that once made decisions based on comfort or familiarity is being replaced by a version that values alignment and depth. And that shift requires you to pause, to observe, to reconsider. It's not regression. It's the moment you realize growth is internal, not external. At some point, something shifts. Not externally, but internally. You stop looking for immediate answers. You stop trying to force direction. You begin to understand that this phase isn't about figuring everything out. It's about becoming someone who sees things differently. You realize that growth isn't always visible. It doesn't always come with big changes or obvious results. Sometimes it's quiet. It's the way you respond instead of react. The way you pause instead of rushing. The way you choose differently, even in small moments. And those small shifts begin to build something deeper. Something more stable. Something that isn't dependent on external validation or constant certainty. If any part of this feels familiar, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, personal way, take a moment to reflect on it. Not everything needs to be solved immediately. Sometimes, simply recognizing that you're changing is enough. And if you've been noticing these shifts in your own life, it would be interesting to hear how you're experiencing them. Because this phase looks different for everyone, even though the feeling behind it is often the same. When your old motivation stops working. At some point, you start noticing that the things that used to push you forward don't have the same effect anymore. The pressure you once used to stay productive feels heavier now. The goals that once gave you direction feel less meaningful. Even the idea of staying busy starts to feel empty. And this can be unsettling. Because for a long time, your motivation may have been tied to external validation. Progress meant achieving something visible. Growth meant doing more, pushing harder, proving something. But now that drive starts fading. Not because you've become lazy, but because you're no longer driven by the same internal wiring. This is where a lot of people misjudge themselves. They think they've lost discipline. They assume they've become inconsistent. But what's actually happening is deeper than that. Your mind is no longer satisfied with surface-level rewards. You're beginning to seek meaning, not just momentum. And that changes everything. Because once your awareness shifts, you can't go back to being motivated by things that no longer feel aligned. The gap between who you were and who you're becoming. There's a space that exists during growth that feels difficult to explain. It's not your past, and it's not your future. It's the gap in between. In this space, your old identity doesn't fully fit anymore, but your new identity hasn't fully formed yet. You may notice this in the way you speak, the way you think, even the way you carry yourself. Certain reactions you used to have no longer feel natural. Certain behaviors feel out of place. But at the same time, you're still figuring out what replaces them. This can create hesitation. You pause more, you think more, you question more. And sometimes, that pause can feel like a lack of confidence. But it's not. It's awareness expanding. You're no longer operating on autopilot. You're becoming intentional. And intentionality often feels slower, but it's far more powerful in the long run. Why you're more selective with your energy. One of the clearest signs of internal change is how you begin to manage your energy. You start noticing what drains you, not just physically but mentally. Certain environments feel overwhelming. Certain conversations feel repetitive. Certain habits feel unnecessary. And instead of pushing through like you used to, you start pulling back. Not aggressively, not dramatically. Just quietly choosing where your energy goes. This can sometimes be misunderstood by others. They may think you've become distant, less available, less engaged. But from your perspective, it's not about withdrawal. It's about alignment. You're no longer willing to give your attention to things that don't add value to your growth. And that doesn't come from ego. It comes from clarity. Because once you become aware of how your energy affects your state of mind, you naturally start protecting it. The internal CONVRSATONS, no one else hears. A lot of this transformation doesn't happen in visible ways. It happens internally, in the quiet moments, in the thoughts you don't say out loud, in the questions you ask yourself when no one else is around. You start analyzing your patterns, reflecting on your choices, reevaluating your direction. And these internal conversations can be intense at times. Not in a negative way, but in a deep introspective way. You may find yourself sitting in silence more often. Not because you're disconnected, but because you're processing. You're understanding yourself on a deeper level. And that level of awareness requires space. It requires stillness. Because growth isn't just about what you do. It's about how you understand what you do. When you stop trying to explain yourself, there comes a point where you realize that not everything you're experiencing can be easily explained to others. You try at first. You try to put your thoughts into words. You try to describe what's changing, what you're feeling, what you're noticing. But it doesn't always land the way you expect. Not because people don't care, but because they're not experiencing the same shift. And slowly, you stop trying to over-explain. You become more comfortable with your internal process. You realize that not everything needs to be validated externally. Some things are meant to be understood privately. This doesn't mean you isolate yourself. It just means you no longer depend on others to confirm your growth. You trust your own awareness. And that trust becomes a foundation. The difference between ESCAPING and EVOLVING. It's important to recognize something here. Not every change is growth. Sometimes people try to escape discomfort by constantly changing their environment, their goals, or their direction. But what you're experiencing is different. This isn't about running away from something. It's about moving towards something more aligned. The difference is subtle but important. Escaping feels reactive. Evolving feels intentional. Even when it's uncertain. Even when it's uncomfortable. There's a quiet sense that you're not just avoiding your old life. You're outgrowing it. And that distinction matters. Because it keeps you grounded. It reminds you that this process isn't random. It's reflective. The shift from seeking approval to seeking alignment. At some point, something clicks. You stop asking, does this look right? And you start asking, does this feel right? That shift changes how you make decisions. You become less concerned with how things appear externally and more focused on how they resonate internally. This affects everything: your choices, your priorities, your direction. You begin to value authenticity over approval, depth over appearance, meaning over noise. And while this may not always lead to immediate results, it leads to something more sustainable. Because when your actions are aligned with your internal state, you don't need constant validation to keep going. You move with clarity, even when things aren't fully figured out. When progress becomes less visible but more real. One of the most challenging parts of growth is that it often becomes less visible over time. In the beginning, progress feels obvious. You can measure it, track it, show it. But as you evolve, the changes become internal. They show up in your mindset, your perspective, your awareness. And these things aren't always easy to quantify. You might not have big external milestones to point to, but internally you feel different. More grounded, more aware, more intentional. And sometimes that can feel like you're not progressing because you can't see it the same way. But this is actually a deeper level of growth because it's not dependent on external results. It's built on internal change. And internal change is what lasts. The identity shift you can't reverse. Eventually, you reach a point where you realize something important. You can't go back to who you used to be. Not because you're forcing yourself forward, but because your awareness has changed. You see things differently now. You think differently. You process life differently. And once that shift happens, it's permanent. Even if you tried to go back to old patterns, they wouldn't feel the same. Because you've already seen beyond them. This is where your identity begins to stabilize. Not in a fixed way, but in a grounded way. You're no longer defined by external roles or temporary phases. You're defined by your awareness, by your ability to observe, adapt, and grow. And that creates a sense of internal stability that doesn't rely on everything being perfect. If you've been in this phase where things feel unclear, but at the same time, quietly meaningful, that's not something to rush through. It's something to understand. Because this stage, this in-between space, is where some of the most important changes happen. Not externally, but internally. And if you've been noticing these shifts in your own way, in your own time, it's worth paying attention to that. Everyone experiences this differently, but the underlying pattern is often similar. So if you feel like sharing your perspective, or what this phase has been like for you, that conversation can be more valuable than it seems.